The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. Welcome back. Today is our discussion of chapters
10 and 11.
I already forgot. 10 and 11. I almost said Wolf Dreams, just flipping to the wrong page.
Secrets
Chapter 10,
and Tar Valon.
Secrets, and Chapter 11, Tar Valon. That, of course, is Tylor. Tylor, how's it going?
It's going great. I get to interrupt you on a podcast, and that's just a fun thing to do. And let's be honest, this is a Wheel of Time podcast. And if you are listening to this live, man, is this an exciting time for Wheel of Time. We've got some episodes coming up for you discussing the television show. And as we discuss that, first off, those episodes are premiering on Friday. That is 2 days from now, August 4th. Make sure that you are checking in if you are interested in hearing us talk about the television show that Amazon has put together about the Wheel of Time. But before we discuss all of our plans on that, if you are listening live, you are aware that Hollywood is on fire at the moment. And we want to have a brief discussion about that because it is relevant to our podcast. Greg, begin said discussion.
So off air, we were just having a little bit of a discussion because it's a bit unclear what people in our position should be doing to show their solidarity with the actors and writers who are currently on strike in Hollywood. This episode, after this very brief digression, will be about a book, and we don't really worry about it because it's about a book and that's no problem. But we do have these special episodes that we've been planning and that we've recorded that are about the television show. And in many ways, those could be viewed as promoting the television show that Amazon is writing. Well, so let's just get out of the way first that Tylor and I think, have been / are union members at different times in our professional careers.
Lord knows I'm an actor. Obviously, you've picked up on this.
But we are not SAG or WGA members, but we do stand in solidarity, largely speaking, with unions. I mean, this show has been a celebration of a writer primarily in the television episodes. We are praising creatives, actors, actresses, writers on that show. And so we stand by these people getting what they're owed in this kind of shifting economics of Hollywood and streaming economy. So more than anything, we just don't want to cross that line and to be against the writers. So our best understanding of the current strike guidelines, and I will say we are recording this on July 24th. So this may have actually shifted since when you hear this. But as of today, what it appears to be is that the union is saying that their membership should not do kind of review, rewatch podcasts, but that they're not worried about amateurs at this moment. And Tylor and I are nothing if not amateur. So we see our role as celebrating the work that strong creatives have done on the first season of the television show. And we strongly endorse you watching that work and celebrating the work of those creatives on that first season of the television show. And if you should ever hear my voice or Tylor's voice saying how you should watch season 2, because maybe we recorded that 2 months ago, then make sure you hear from us and know that while we endorse watching television shows, we more heartily endorse paying actors and writers. Tylor, have I misrepresented your views in any way?
Not in any way. I'm not like yay union on everything, but oh my God, is SAG-AFTRA and the WGA right about this dispute? And let me just speak to anyone in those unions who is listening right now. Please, for the love of God, negotiate some sort of settlement before my semester starts, because I'm teaching a class called Hollywood Economics this semester, and I don't want it to just be the strike class. Please help me out here. And with that plea, I think it is time to move on from Hollywood and the disaster that it hopefully will avoid becoming if these negotiations go in the favor of the unions. And instead, let's move on to the book, unless Greg has something to add.
All I'm going to add is just repeating again, we stand with the unions, but tune in Friday for our first of 4 episodes celebrating the work of great creatives on the previous season of the television show. Just a reminder, I know you've probably heard us say this before, but there are 4 episodes dropping. They are each about 2 episodes of the television program. So Friday the 4th, you want to have episode 1 and 2 watched, and then 2 episodes by Friday each week. Let's talk about something slightly less complicated. You know, publishing doesn't have any labor issues. Publishing doesn't have any compensation issues. On to chapter 10 and 11 of The Wheel of Time. Tyler, tell me some secrets.
So I actually have one more thing to discuss with you before we talk about secrets. Because I don't know where we put this. I think we should have an ill-advised discussion of visual media today talking about a map, but I am willing to put that off until chapter 11 if you think that is the best way to do this.
Ooh, good question. Let's put it off to the start of chapter 11, and I say that purely because my book has page 1 of chapter 11 and then the map on the subsequent page.
Mine is exactly the same.
I do know that there are some listeners, maybe one of whom I had a beer and saw a Wes Anderson movie with last week, who says he does not like when we cross that line. We talk about one chapter and then the other. So please.
I just need to make the listeners aware that I am willing to accept Greg's endorsement of unions, but not Greg's endorsement of Wes Anderson. Chapter 10, Secrets. Egwene, which, by the way, POV change, very exciting, is trying to see Tar Valon in the distance. She knows that she's getting close because she can see Dragonmount, and she starts thinking about how she needs to go to Tar Valon because it's where she can learn what she needs to so that she never is going to be collared again. She also thinks about all of the terrible dreams she's been having, in particular about Rand both chasing something and being chased, and she thinks of Tar Valon as a place where she will be able to see Anaya again, who can help her figure out what is going on with her dreams. At this point, Nynaeve approaches and basically starts treating Egwene kind of like a child, and she's still the wisdom, and Egwene responds by asking about Lan, mostly to piss off Nynaeve, and then Egwene starts thinking about all the secrets in the group, the things that the girls have learned that they shouldn't do, what Verin is hiding. Obviously, Matt has the Horn of Valir. And then we get an update on Matt's condition. He apparently hasn't woken in 3 days. Healing is no longer working on him. And Verin basically says he may have hours left. At this point, Hurin approaches, says that it's just a hunch, but he's seen some tracks and he is worried that there is going to be danger up ahead. At this point, the girls start talking about how they can defend themselves, but they shouldn't. It's a Chekhov's gun that will go off in the next 5 pages. At this point, finally, we get some action. The White Cloaks arrive. They start questioning Verin. They seem to basically be, trying to get them taken in for questioning. Verin is denying them. And at this point, all of the girls panic. Elaine declares that she is the daughter heir of Andor and is told by the White Cloaks that her mother no longer supports the Aes Sedai the way that she once did. And then Egwene says, "Oh, Elaine, you give away a little information. Let's blow them up," and starts making explosions of earth. Most of the White Cloaks immediately flee, but one of them stays behind. Verin chastises Egwene for using the power as a weapon because Aes Sedai obviously cannot do that by the oaths. And at this point, we learn that the White Cloak who has been left behind is Dane Bornhald, the son of Joffrey Bornhald from the previous book. Egwene then tells him that they are coming from Toman Head. Verin is furious at her, and then they let him go and get into Tar Valon. And that is a lot of description of, I think, a pretty good chapter. It gets us the catch-up we need and gives us something new to think about. So, Greg, what was your takeaway from Secrets, a chapter that really isn't at all about secrets?
I don't know if you know this about me. I am a huge Conan fan.
I did not know that.
One of Conan's old bits was to have a celebrity sit under a light. People can look this up on YouTube, and they would say their last name and then go secrets and then say some jokes. So as soon as I read this chapter title, I immediately thought, so my favorite one basically of all time is David Bowie, and he's under the light, and he says, like, one time on tour in 1979, my band and I took the stage in Cincinnati. As I started the show, I said to the crowd, "It's great to be in Cincinnati." It was not great to be in Cincinnati. And then just, stamp Bowie secrets. And so like that level of stupid Conan O'Brien humor, but it really made me laugh that this whole time I was going, Egwene, secrets. Nynaeve, secrets. One word to sum up this chapter is just tension. I feel like the whole point is like, hey, nobody's really happy right now. And where I think the events at the end of the chapter felt significant, and oh no, you just started a chain of dominoes. It didn't feel like the first half was quite in that register. It was more in the remember what's been happening with these characters register. So I didn't find the first half that compelling. There are some little things here and there, but and actually, to be honest, it wasn't like I found the last part so crazy compelling. It was just like, oh no, like we're gonna have trouble. This has consequences.
100%. And I think that we want to start with all those little details in the beginning, because if there's one thing I think this podcast can do, it's pick out which little details are fun and exciting that you easily kind of skim through the first time with a chapter like this, right? I think this is the kind
You're
of chapter
saying this podcast when it's you on that one. But go ahead. Yes, no, this podcast can do that.
I just need to be very,
this podcast.
I just need to be very clear. You point out more smart things than I do on the podcast, where I know a lot of smart things. The first thing that jumped out to me as interesting in this chapter is the way that Egwene is thinking about the city of Tar Valon. At different points in this chapter, she thinks of it as home and then feels guilty about that, as the place she needs to go to learn things so she won't be in a collar, and then also as kind of the scariest place for her. It seems like all of the things she's done in the past 3-4 months in the last book are now really catching up to her as she's finally getting back where she originally came from. And I found that kind of uncertainty in her head to be the most compelling part about the early section of the chapter. Is just she doesn't quite know where she fits, so we're kind of figuring that out with her. Was there any details in that, or any of the kind of Egwene character moments early on that you thought were especially compelling, or anything that stood out?
Yeah, that set of emotions you just dictated to me felt it felt like how like the British view college, right?
Okay.
Like there's a big difference over there with how kind of colleges are structured and the way you feel an affiliation to it. So my wife and I took a trip to London, and we did a day trip up to Cambridge, and it was very interesting to kind of recognize, okay, so it's like we use the fake terminology here. Like when you have a college at Cambridge, that's like your Hogwarts house almost, and the way different things operate. And I think the way in which their universities have that kind of home boarding school feel that ours don't quite get, even though our students live in dorms, and also that kind of competitive, if you don't pass the exam, you're going to get kicked out, which again, most schools in America, especially these days, aren't kicking people out willy-nilly. We all need the enrollment. So it feels like that mix of emotions just to me felt very much. And I've mentioned before the Patrick Rothfuss book that's focused on an academy, books, plural, 2, still not 3, that focus a kind of fantasy world on a university, feel very similar. But I did like that. I mean, I had just enough to tap into that from being an undergrad, that like, yes, that excitement, that is this home now? No, it's not really home, but fear and enthusiasm and all those things.
100%. And I don't really have anything to add to that other than like, that's spot on. And I think that this feeling of right, she is coming back to her sophomore year of college after getting kicked out of school for running away. And I can understand why that would be trepidatious for a 19-year-old girl. Actually, she's 17, so even worse. The other thing that jumped out to me in this section is not important at all, but I'm always on Bella watch, and Bella is with them and not with the boys. So that's very important. Nynaeve gives us one kind of new interesting detail that I think we'd maybe gotten hints at before, but it's really kind of made more concrete here. Nynaeve says that she can feel a storm coming. The weather is beautiful. And then the way that Egwene describes it in, I think, just the text, it's her thoughts, is Nynaeve's powers now don't just apply to storms, they apply to men. And I think that that update is kind of an interesting thing that we hadn't seen from Nynaeve's power set before. So I'm curious. I found the rest of the Nynaeve stuff to kind of just be catching up, but was there anything else that jumped out to you, or did that kind of tweak in her powers strike you?
It was interesting, so much of the language around this is like storms coming. I can feel it in my bones, both from her and from Verin and actually Hurin too. They all kind of have this like imposing doom, and then seemingly doom comes or arrives at the end. So I think that emotion stood out to me more than this extension that you're mentioning. I continue to be curious in terms of Nynaeve because this is so much a familiar Rand is the chosen one narrative, and so much of her story. Like if you only read the Nynaeve chapters, it's like, no, this is a chosen one narrative about her.
Totally.
And especially when, male, female, light, dark kind of dualities here, it's making me curious. Are they on a collision course of some kind, or destined to be opposites, opposed perhaps, but not opposed in the like combative sense, but just like opposites. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of those places in the book that really sets up opportunities, right? We see a lot of like hints at things coming, and they're vague enough at this point that we can say, okay, it could be one of these 80 things. And one of my favorite things about Robert Jordan is I think he does a really good job of red herringing things, right? And I'm not saying that's what you're picking up on now, right? I think you have identified a very valid, interesting thread that we need to keep tracking, but there's just so many hints and visions. And as you say, we have three different characters saying, I've got a bad feeling about this in the same chapter. Like, that just gets me excited in a way that sometimes I think when you do it once, it just doesn't hit the same way. And Robert Jordan knows how to layer the same idea in different ways so it doesn't feel repetitive. And I guess what I'm saying here is I don't have much else to say about the next like 4 pages of this chapter because it's kind of the same thing again from Hurin. Just because I don't want to lose the Hurin thread, the end of this chapter, or actually that's next chapter, we won't talk about it. Let's ignore Hurin entirely until the following chapter. Is there anything else before the White Cloaks show up that jumped out to you? Because that is kind of my list from the early section of the chapter.
Chalk this up to, again, maybe trying to read with a screaming toddler nearby. They have a bag that they want to deliver to the Amyrlin seat.
Yes.
Is the bag the horn, or is the bag something else? I was missing some details there.
I believe the horn. I think it's one of those things where in one place at the very beginning of the chapter, they drop that it is a bag with the horn, and then they just refer to it as the bag the rest of the chapter. But yes, I am almost certain that is the case. And if it is not named in the text, I'm pretty sure that is the case.
So why does the Amyrlin seat want the horn, or why do they want that? Is it just safekeeping? Lock it in your Gringotts vault? Okay.
Excellent question, which I would also color with our revelation from the end of the last book. Verin may not be as on the up and up as we thought. So I think it's both right to be questioning those motives and also doubting the way that Verin is presenting the motives. And I think that's setting up a very good mystery that hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll get some hints at. But I don't have anything else to add as far as why she is pulling that away from Mat or getting it to the Amyrlin or what have you. I guess the last thing here is Mat is in a real bad way.
Yeah,
I don't really have anything else
I expected
to say
him
about
to be better, right? Yeah. Not cured, but doing better. And it certainly seems like he didn't even rebound at all. He's still just headed downward. So, I think it's funny because the structure of this podcast, blah, 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 things I've said before, it's like, yeah, we're just starting out in this book. And then it's like, oh no, we're already like 25% into this. I'm not doing an e-reader that tells me the actual percentages, but approaching a quarter, basically.
This is week 5 of 25, if we are thinking about this book in weeks.
Closer to 20.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is interesting that it felt like we hit with a lot more momentum, and this is almost we're switching story threads, so you need
Yeah,
to spend that time catching up. But so much of what you were describing about the like storms coming feels like what you do at the opening of a book. So I'm
yeah,
excited to see where that goes, and I was excited to see that. And then again, it's almost immediately like, and the storm's here, or it's almost like the
yeah.
first peal of thunder in the storm, I think.
Yeah, and I think that one of the most interesting things about this chapter is that it begins kind of establishing we have made it and then shows just how dangerous it is right before you've made it. And then, of course, the twist at the end of the chapter is Verin says, and it'll be even worse once we get there. So the White Cloaks show up. We get, I think the initial scene of the interrogation, if you will, or the interview with Verin, I think just kind of highlights just how much Verin is willing to just be like, I don't care what you say. I'm just going to keep walking past you. But it's not a whole lot going on there other than, as you said earlier, building just a ton of tension. Did that early section kind of work for you, or did it really start once the girls went crazy, as I'm going to describe it?
There was a very similar scene that we have watched in the television show, and I will leave it that vague, that made me read this as automatically tense. Because, I think there is a reading of the White Cloaks that has them a bit more neutral, despite, all that we've seen about them. So it kind of put me on edge as soon as they approached. And I think a lot of Robert Jordan's language, or especially Verin's response, it's like, oh, they've gotten quite bold, right?
Yeah.
Like they are acting in a fashion that is out of the normal, whatever uneasy tension existed before. It now seems like it's on the surface. Actually, politics corner. It reminds me of how most people read Donald Trump, where it's like everybody was racist, they just couldn't say it, and now they can say it. I'm like, somebody told these White Cloaks, like, do whatever you want, like,
Yeah.
go right ahead. And I think that's kind of the attitude I read in them.
And I think that's absolutely right. And I think the question that I want to follow up with then is, why is that the case, right? Because we've seen White Cloaks in the past couple books behaving, even when they were like in the Caroline grass with Perrin and Egwene in the first book when Hopper died, they were still relatively cautious, I feel like, relative to what we're seeing here. And so my question is, why is that different? What has changed? And I think at least part of that answer has to do with what we learn towards the end of this chapter. The White Cloaks know what happened at Falme and think they know that the Aes Sedai were fighting at Falme. And so my read on this is, once you know your enemy isn't holding back anymore, you've got to be bold too. And that's what the White Cloaks think they're seeing, even though we know that is not the case at all. It was actually the Seanchan.
Some nice bit of dramatic irony there that
Yeah.
we know everything. We know what happened, and we know what they were told and why I'm not going to say we know everything. I'm sure that there's still things but we understand these two perspectives because of all the information we have. So just a shout out that's nice construction. Hey, that's why you pay writers. They do good things. And then, so I think I'm excited to see like how that plays out, right? There's an old adage about usually movies and televisions where a good fight means you have to actually believe both sides. And like, this is a version of that. It doesn't mean you agree with the White Cloaks, but you understand that based on their facts, this is what they're arguing and why they'd be arguing it. And I think that makes it very effective.
Yeah, and I think that the reveal in the middle of this battle, that we're not just learning some generic White Cloak who believes what they believe. We are dealing with Dane Bornhald, who has a very personal reason to kind of accept and internalize these beliefs. His father died in a battle that he believes was a result of the Aes Sedai, more or less killing his father. So that, I think, really colors things. And then, of course, we get both Elaine and Egwene doing some kind of impulsive stuff. So we've got kind of three kind of characters really standing out to me in this conflict. We've got Dane Bornhald, we've got Elaine, and we've got Egwene. Which of them would you like to discuss first? Because I've got things to say about all three.
Elaine seems like the one to kind of check off and move along
Yeah.
because it doesn't seem like there's any real answer there. It's like she's crazy. I mean, what does a privileged person do? And myself totally
Hmm.
included, but drop your privilege as soon as things get tense. You're like, actually. Do you know who I am? Is kind of the move she makes. And I think, we've used lots of metaphors about destabilizing, but
Yeah.
you know, so much of this, as we just alluded to, is about the fact that the rumor from the West got east faster,
Yeah.
and they weren't even considering what may need to come west to them.
Yeah.
And so it seems clear, like whether what they say is true or not, we've missed a beat with the
Yeah.
queen, and we got some catching up to do, and that should and does really destabilize Elaine.
Yeah, and I think the only addition that I have to that is you're absolutely right. The new information we gain, really interesting, and as you say, kind of ambiguous to the point where we still have a lot of things to answer. The only other thing that I need to do is just point out how absolutely stupid it is to be like, "Oh, I'm a really great kidnapping target," when you're outnumbered by a bunch of people who want
Yeah.
to take you in for questioning. Um, Given that we're talking about the girls, let's then talk about Egwene, who both decides violence is the answer and
Yeah.
also apologizes by telling Dane Bornhald everything she wasn't supposed to tell him. Um, I'm normally a huge like Egwene is great because she's kind of thoughtful person, but not in this scene. And I think
Mm.
that's telling, in particular, given that she was dwelling so much on her horrific experiences in the previous book at the beginning of this chapter. So I'm curious on what your take is on where Egwene is and kind of what you pulled out of this sequence, because there's a lot going on for her, and we're in her head, so there's another layer to it too.
It did definitely on first blush feel out of character. I then tried to justify it to myself. It's like, well, this isn't just like Egwene, Teehee, Triddle Dee Dee. It's like she went through a horrific experience that we only got a small taste of.
Yep.
There was a giant climactic battle, and then they've been hoofing it across a continent for a
Yeah.
long time. So I think I can justify her acting a bit out of character with those
Yeah.
dynamics at play. And then, as you alluded to before, she's also young. Like
Yeah.
again, somebody said the other day, "What are your Facebook memories for?" But to remind you how stupid you were, at like
Mm-hmm.
18, 19, and you're like, "I posted that on the internet and thought that was a fun, good, funny thing or whatever."
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think we should always bear that in
Yeah.
mind as well. That a rational teenager is not rational. So,
100%.
uh,
And we've got a 17-year-old with PTSD that we are reading about here. So I think it is very understandable that she would behave erratically, that she would jump to, I need to not be in a cage no matter what. Like, this all makes sense to me, but I think it's a really kind of interesting direction for this character to go. Because I think at the end of the last book, you could either say, like, okay, it's time to reset for Egwene. We're going to tell a story about a girl going to magic college. And instead, it seems like Robert Jordan is much more interested in almost like a, someone who's come back after being a POW kind of story, which,
mm,
given what we know about Robert Jordan's history, is probably a story he's able to write from a little bit more kind of knowledge of. I don't know whether he himself suffered from post traumatic stress, but he fought in Vietnam. I'm sure he knew someone who did.
yeah. Well, and it's funny because so much of that sounds like actually the generation before that, right? GI Bill and the
Yeah.
soldiers, and we're like, I know what to do. Put them all in the high stress world of colleges and universities, and that
Yep.
that did a lot of good. But I think there was a lot of struggle and turmoil that we would recognize now with our more modern sense of PTSD and so on. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I guess then the last character who we need to talk about is Dane Bornhald, who I am mostly just sad on your behalf because I know your devotion to this man's father's first name, and that is the thing that is gone from our lives. How are you doing with Dane instead of Joffrey?
It's fine. It's a little too Dane Cook for me.
Nice.
Right? Like that's the association I have with
Yeah.
Dane, which is weird because I think my father-in-law is Danish. Yeah. So, it was nice to see. kind of a really obvious, like, well, here's how we got the word faster. Like, here's a
Yeah.
reminder. I'm a Star Wars fan. I'm a sucker for intergenerational trauma and
Yeah.
being the sins of the father tropes and so on. So, give me a son out for redemption and to right the wrongs. And that's compelling to me and should be good storytelling in this warped way where we know it's all wrong and been interpreted poorly, but it should
Yeah.
still be exciting.
Well, and I just need to give myself a pat on the back. I'm pretty sure I made it 2 full books, never calling Joffrey Dane, and that was my main objective with that character. I don't have anything else really to say about this. Verin gives kind of an ominous warning at the end of the chapter, and then in the next chapter, we arrive at the place that she gave an ominous warning about. So, given that we now need to do a mid-episode ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast, Greg, I need you to start this off because when we originally talked about this map last week, we definitely would have lost our clean rating on this podcast. So I'm going to let you set the tone before I jump in.
I believe the way we approached it is we said, there's an old joke in Dungeons and Dragons play, which is whatever the DM draws as the map, it inevitably looks like a penis. And this is the other side of that coin.
Yes.
So the best joke I had when we discussed it is no man has ever found the North Harbor, even if he thinks he has. And I'll let our listeners, I'll stop there so we can keep it. So what is interesting about this is it does look like, and then the chapter informs us a little bit more. It does look to me like the model of a European city, right?
Yeah.
Paris more than perhaps any other, although I don't know my German cities terribly well, where you have kind of a bustling city on an island in the middle of a river, not in the middle of a lake, right?
Yeah.
So that to me is very cool. And I think I've said before, I had a coworker whose wife said is if she opens a book and sees a map, she shuts the book. That's not a
Yeah.
book for her. And I'm the opposite. Like I get excited whenever we see a map. And this is like exactly what I want in a fantasy map. It's like, okay, it's got a logic to it. It's like, okay, what would be the stronghold, the citadel in the very center, and then kind of the city built around it, and then these outlying villages that sit on each of the major trade routes into the city. So that's nice because I do think bad fantasy, bad sci-fi just has fun drawing a map and not actually thinking about a logic of why it would be built that way.
Yeah, I have to say I'm with you. Anytime there's a map in a book, that is something that attracts me to it. And I think this is a really good map for me, in part because of exactly what you're saying. It's cohesive. I always do this with economies. Anytime someone picks out a price of something in a book, I'm immediately like, okay, the next time something costs 2 coppers, let's see if this makes sense, right? And I think this map makes sense, right? You can look at it and go, okay, here's why these things are built here. Here's how this was arranged. And any unnaturalness of it, we do need to remember this is an island that was artificially created by the One Power 3,000 years ago. So there's nothing wrong with geographically it being a little weird. That being said, I have one major complaint about this book, and it is my number one complaint that I can have about literally any map. Why is North not up? Why? Why would you do this to me? As someone who is a dungeon master and has to describe the orientation of things from a map, anytime up isn't north, I hate you. It's the worst. I really like this map. I think that it's got some really cool kind of little details that make me go like, that's exciting or interesting. In particular, the Ogier Grove stands out to me. And then the last thing that I wanted to note, which I just absolutely love, is in the bottom right corner, where we get just a little sketch of the White Tower. And that's something that I don't think we get anywhere else. We don't have a lot of architectural icons or drawings. So getting something that we can kind of put in our heads as that's what the White Tower looks like, I find I had never noticed that before, honestly. I'm like, ooh, that's cool.
It stuck out to me as we turned to this page for this discussion because White Tower, I assume just kind of like literal pristine ivory, and the way the tower is depicted with these kind of swirls that look like doodles in a kid's notebook, and it's it is just a line sketch, so I assume who knows if those are meant to be shapes on the tower or colors or something, but it is very interesting to me that you look at that icon and you could do a very clean version of that, and they
Yeah.
didn't do that. They have a kind of filled in version.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing that I'd just say about it is it just looks like classic, like fantasy wizard castle, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
I often expect Robert Jordan to take a lot of the tropes and change them. And this just looks like where Merlin lives.
Well, I think we talked about with some of those covers in the first two books, like there is just a school of fantasy art. I think
Mm-hmm.
these days we think of it as on Vans. I associate with the Hildebrandt brothers who did
Yep.
Lord of the Rings and some Star Wars work at particularly important moments. And it's just, yeah, it's all just a little like actually like the animated Hobbit, right? Like it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's just kind of how it is. That's what fantasy is. And I think Game of Thrones and modern
Mm-hmm.
fantasy has made us all want it to look more medieval than like
Yep.
than Renaissance fair. And
Yep.
and it's like it's kind of a refreshing thing to see the Renaissance fair version again.
Yeah, and I think this is something that I think evolves just a little bit out of the time frame, right? Robert Jordan is writing in the 90s. He doesn't have quite as many built up tropes to rail against as George R. Martin does by the time we get there. And with that, I think we stop talking about the map of Tar Valon and start talking about chapter 11, Tar Valon. So the group approaches the village of Derain, which is a village at the entrance to Tar Valon, and it has gone through some stuff. We get the history of the village, and it's been razed probably 5 or 6 times, but it keeps getting rebuilt every time. They approach kind of the bridge that will take them into Tar Valon, and they bypass a line of maybe 100 carts. And so a guard stops them, and as soon as Verin takes off her hood and he sees her face, he immediately lets them through, but she stops to talk to him. She gets a little bit of detail about the White Cloaks and what issues they are causing around the area, and we basically learn that there are now rumors of a false dragon who is supposedly being supported by Aes Sedai. And then Verin gives a very Aes Sedai answer when he asks about this. She basically says, like, oh, rumors are often not true, but doesn't actually say anything to contradict the specifics of what he's saying. So at this point, Egwene starts to feel like she's coming home as they make their way through the city, but she starts to feel guilty about it. And then she actually has a thought that she's outgrown the two rivers, and if she ever goes back, she'll be doing it to visit her family. And I just thought that was a moment worth noting. Tar Valon is gorgeous. And then as soon as they get inside, Verin hides her face again as they make their way through the city. Egwene asks if she's expecting trouble, and Verin basically says, yeah, all of the things that you just did outside of the city could get you stilled and or killed, and that's not a great place to be. Once they arrive at the tower, Hurin announces that he is going to be leaving. He says that he needs to hurry and tell King Isar and Agelmar that the dragon is reborn. And basically everyone seems kind of frustrated that he has left as quickly as he has, except for Verin, who's just like, yeah, whatever, go. At this point, Verin gives some secret orders to a guard who runs off to obey, and then she takes the bag, as you had noted before. And when she does so, then Sheriam, the Mistress of Novices, arrives along with 3 accepted. Matt is taken in his travois to be healed, presumably. Verin basically says, does everybody know I'm here? And is told, yes, absolutely. And then Sheriam basically tells the girls, you will say nothing until the Merlin seat sees you. There will be some sort of punishment for her running away. And my favorite moment in the chapter is when Egwene says, yes, Aes Sedai, and gets a withering glare for speaking. We then realize that the people who will be enforcing the basically house arrest of these 3 girls is not the Mistress of Novices, but the accepted who are brought along. And we are introduced to a couple of these accepted. Valon, who seems to be in charge of Nynaeve and is basically goading them into speaking so she can kind of punish them for it. And then we also meet Theodrin, who seems much nicer and is willing to enforce the rules, but isn't going to do anything to cause them harm. There's also a third who doesn't get a name, which as far as I'm concerned means that the 2 who do get names must be important. And that's basically what I have, other than at the end of the chapter, Valon is definitely going to be a red, is the conclusion that Egwene has. So this I find an interesting chapter because it kind of introduces a lot of characters, including the character of the city of Tar Valon, but doesn't really do a whole lot else as far as I'm concerned. Are new names enough to get you to power through a chapter, Greg?
I was thinking as your summary went on, and don't take that as an insult, but a
No.
little bit as an insult. I was like, wow, this is a way longer summary than my notes. My notes are like three things. It's like, yep, they get there. They establish the city in all the ways you just described, which is engaging and fun, and with
Yep.
the map works well. And then it's like, oh, they walk up and separate. And
Yep.
that was really like all that was in my notes. So tell me some of the things I'm not appreciating enough, perhaps.
I want to actually start talking about the first two paragraphs of this chapter, which bizarrely are not really told from Egwene's POV. Like, technically, we're in her head, but we basically get a couple paragraph description of the village of Durane. I don't know how it's pronounced, but we get the description
Duran
of
Duran.
Yeah, that one. And what I find interesting about this is that it is a really concise reminder of every major moment in history that you probably need to have in your mind as you read this book. So let's just go over all of them, right? When has this city been burned down? Number one, during the Trolloc Wars. That we are talking about is the 1,000 years after the breaking of the world, when the Trollocs still roamed the world and basically sacked any city that attempted to build itself up. Then we learn that the city was destroyed when Arthur Hawkwing laid siege to Tar Valon. So that was about 1,000 years ago, and we know that Arthur Hawkwing had kind of an agenda against the Aes Sedai. That was what set up his descendants, the Shan-Chan, being so anti-channeling. Third, we learn that the city was destroyed during the 100 Years' War. That was the war that followed Arthur Hawkwing dying and the large number of kingdoms fighting over the land that he had once claimed. And then we learned that it was destroyed 20 years ago during the Aiel War. That is just a good list of things that you should have in your notes or your brain palace or however you remember Wheel of Time things. I have nothing else to say about it other than I think those are important marks to have. Did that section engage you the way it did me? Because I actually found it to be good, given that it's basically just history we already know.
It certainly worked as a good reminder. And again, I've had London on the mind. And one of my favorite things about walking around London is you can just accidentally run into like the Roman wall that they built. And you're like, this is like a 2,000-year-old wall. Not quite. I don't have my timelines right. But you're like, oh my God, like you can just run into something a way we don't get in an American city. Although, and then, again, London's a city that was burned to the ground by an accidental fire and then built back up. So we have some cities in America that get that. It's just all on a smaller time scale, right?
Yeah.
But listeners know that I really enjoy up here. We can study revolutionary history, and I went for a walk with my son today, and I was like, this tree has Revolutionary War bullets in it. Like they've x-rayed this tree, and there are bullets that were fired at the British Army. And like, so that is always really cool. And the fact that you can throw that into kind of a fantasy context just makes it work. It also just, again, we were kind of ragging on bad fantasy before. Bad fantasy is just like, I designed a cool city, not actually thinking about the millennia that lead up to what a city is and how a city puts together.
I actually want to say Robert Jordan is avoiding the opposite side of bad fantasy, right? I think one version of bad fantasy is I have not thought this world through, so there are a bunch of arbitrary choices. The other version of bad fantasy is I have thought through everything in this world, and I am going to tell it to you in explicit detail without embedding anything interesting in it. And I think that's what Jordan does well here. He both keeps it short and enough engaging that you're like, oh, this isn't ancient history. It's the story of a 7 times burned village, and that's just more fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've compared it before to like George Lucas, like just reference the Clone Wars, and that's it. And it's definitely like that. But you're right, it's even better at like giving you here, memorize this list, and you'll have the rough outline of history, right? I read a history book once that was called The History of the World in 7 Glasses, and I loved it because it was like, think about these 7 drinks, and it was wine, mead, and it ended with Coca-Cola. Tea was in the middle there, and it's like, if you think of each of these beverages, you get the whole epoch of world
Yeah.
history just like that. And it's like, yeah, everything that happened with colonialism was all about tea. Just remember
Yep.
tea and so on. And so it feels like that. It's like, here's a little mnemonic. Don't worry about all the details. Here are just the ones to memorize.
And if this is a really effective section of reminding us of something that we've been told in the past and feels important, and it feels kind of more interesting and important here, I want to next highlight a couple of really itty bitty tiny moments that I think add up to something a little different than what we've seen in previous books. There are 4 or 5 mentions in this chapter of Verin either hiding her face or exposing her face, or people reacting when she exposes her face. And I think this is something that Robert Jordan once or twice has been like, oh, Moraine's face looks a little odd, or it's hard to put an age on Moraine. But this is the first book where I think the idea of Aes Sedai looking different is being highlighted in a way that I think has kind of been ignored for 2 books. I don't want to call this a retcon. It's more of a new emphasis in a way we hadn't seen before. So I'm curious both if you noticed that everyone in this chapter can identify Verin just by seeing her face, even if they don't know her. And if not, what do you make of this kind of new interesting thing that seems to be happening?
Not going to pretend I clocked it in that level of detail that you just alluded to, but I'll say, I feel like the emotion that came off it is just that it's not safe for Aes Sedai here at the height of their citadel, right? Like, literally as you approach their gates, there was just this fear that everything could go wrong even here. And so that seems to me probably the most important stake for our character, but I'm curious into this added detail you've suggested.
Good. Raising curiosity is the only role that I have on this podcast. The next moment that stood out to me, and please jump in if you have anything that's, I'm missing as we go through this, is Egwene feeling like she is coming home to Tar Valon. And I relate to this really strongly as someone who lived in one place for 25 years of my life and then up and moved, and Boston is home now. And so I really feel like that moment of feeling like, yeah, the Two Rivers feels like home, but I'll only visit there every once in a while, really rang true to me. I don't have anything else to say about it other than good writing, Robert Jordan. Was there anything in that sequence or the other kind of Egwene monologuing section that you thought worked well?
Mostly noting that she's changed and grown. I mean, you want like you said, it's good writing to give us that feeling that we can connect to, but also just good writing to remind us like these characters have now been through a lot. And so we're going to see some growth and some change in them. And so much of that early book, I mean, it was a lot of naive, but it was like, we got to get home. And now it's like, do we? And I think that is something that happens to most people somewhere between 17 and 22.
Absolutely. I have nothing else to add about the girls. Let's talk about Hurin. Hurin is getting what I am going to refer to as the Min treatment, right? Min got built up as this big, important, interesting character in the first couple of chapters from Perrin's POV. And then at the end of that section, Moraine is like, no, you leave for a book, or at least part of a book, right? Hurin seems to be getting exactly the same treatment. He got some highlight in the previous chapter. He was the one who warned them about the White Cloaks and, talked through a couple of things. And now he's off to spread the word about Rand in the North. And, for me, I always just think it's interesting when a character goes off screen, because now you've got someone to kind of track later on. When are they going to come back? What is going to be changed about them? And, when I hear someone going off to more or less preach Rand, that is an especially interesting reason for someone to be leaving the group. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't think we're going to be talking about Hurin much the rest of this book unless he pops up out of nowhere. What are your thoughts as we kind of leave that character behind, at least briefly?
That's fine. He's served his purpose for a while. Like, he's not somebody I'm really going to miss. I thought the reasoning made sense. I was actually just listening to an interview with the director of the new Indiana Jones. Minor spoilers for something not in the movie. Ke Huy Quan is not in the movie. And basically this interviewer was like, why? Like, he's having such a good year. And the director was like, I didn't need more grown-ups in my movie. Like, I
Yeah.
have plenty of adult, and so it feels like that same idea. It's like there are so many characters we can trace. It's okay to drop one for a book or two. In his leaving, he mentions Lord Anglemar. I'm like, oh yeah, that guy's
Yeah, he
still up there.
exists.
Yeah, he was also dropped for a book or so, at least so far. So totally fine with it. Won't miss him thoroughly. It also, there are ways in which Hurin's powers might break plots.
Yeah.
And so it also felt like, let's pull him off the board and we might have a plot where his power would have really come in useful. I did really like Nynaeve's, I believe it was Nynaeve's line, as she's like, men always say just call
Yeah.
if you need anything, and they don't answer, which I thought was really fun.
And accurate of me. Sorry, my phone is always off. Uh, the thing that I think is really interesting about immediately after Hurin leaves is that we get kind of our first look inside of the White Tower, and it seems really bureaucratic in a way that I don't think we've gotten before, right? It's Verin sending a guard to get Sheriam, who brings people who are going to be working as her envoys to enforce the rules to the girls who are slightly below them. It is just massively hierarchical in a way that probably was there in the last book. It just got skimmed over because we only had one chapter in the White Tower. I'm curious, what was your just kind of first impression? We got a little bit of like the girls in their room in the last book, and that was about it. So first look at the outside of the White Tower, how's it looking from a first-time reader's perspective?
I also noted I don't think I called it in my head bureaucratic, but the stiff, the awkwardness, the ceremony before kind of practicality. And this is probably my Star Wars training, but that to me means this is a waning organization, right?
Yep.
Is that once ritual and bureaucracy take over instead of what actually has to be done, that's when it can't be as nimble and responsive, and it falls. And so it's not that at some points of the first book, it was like, let's just get to Tar Valon and everything will be perfect, which pretty much told me that that's never going to be the case. But it certainly now feels like this is going to eventually need to build to some kind of new structure, right? Like that's like 14 books from now, like not imminently, but like all the powers that be are insufficient or incomplete, and so we're going to need something new to replace this. Feels kind of like that.
Absolutely. And I think as we think about that kind of like rot at the center of the White Tower, we can highlight a couple of symptoms that we've already seen. For example, Leandrin is able to get 3 girls away and basically kidnap them. And then when the girls arrive, they're in trouble for it. And as we kind of think about, this is kind of a rotten organization. There are flaws in it. What are kind of those cracks and how are they showing? One thing that really stood out to me in this section is how Verin seems to kind of take advantage of that kind of bureaucracy in order to keep information that she doesn't want out there quiet. Right. And it is very apparent in this chapter that Verin cares about who knows what. She asks Sheriam who knows she has arrived. She makes sure that she takes the horn when the guard is gone. And so no one notices that she has the bag that has, we assume, the horn of Valir in it. And it's worth noting, she's the one who tells Sheriam, don't let these girls say a word until they have spoken to the Merlin. And so I think in a place that didn't have so much structure and rules, the girls would be telling someone something about what happened at Falme, and Verin couldn't control that. And Verin is almost like, look, I know I can tell this person to do this, to do that, to do that, and my secret doesn't get out there. And I think the ability to manipulate the system like that is another symptom of, as you say, a pretty flawed, rough organization that we both think is not long for this world, it seems like, from the portrayal we're given in this chapter.
Yeah, I mean, and what we do get in so much of what you just said and in these moments is like there's just cruelty at the heart of it, right? Yeah. Like and that matters in a fantasy world. Of course, I think all of us have grown skeptical of all our institutions and recognize the cruelty inherent to all of them. But when the kind of treatment of the individuals within that system after all that being said and done is that dark. It's like, yeah, I don't now it's not just I think this is a failing institution. It's like, let's get rid of this institution.
Absolutely. My favorite game in the world is What is Verin Up To, right? I think that
Mm.
is a good game to play. And this is a good chapter for me because it gives me a ton of hints to try to answer that game. Once we get through the Verin section, though, right? Once we are kind of like, okay, here's how she's manipulating the organization, here's the flaws in the organization. What we're left with, I think, is two character introductions. Valon seems mean and possibly evil and definitely going to be a red. And Theodrin has a name. What was your thought on the introduction of these two characters?
I will be the first to say by this point in this chapter, it had finally been like, I don't, okay, like it's just it's kind of like Hogwarts kids, and you're like, what is this, Pavarti or Padma? Which one? Dated Ron? I know, and so it just kind of had that feeling of like, I think these are not that important, but I wasn't terribly invested in either of them.
And that's perfectly reasonable, right? I think we've got what seems to be a minor antagonist and maybe an ally. And I will say, one of my biggest weaknesses in past reads of this series is that Aes Sedai are just kind of Aes Sedai. And there are a couple of other organizations where I'm like, okay, you're in it. You're just one of those people. And so I'm very consciously this time I have an Aes Sedai notebook where I write down the name and description of every Aes Sedai we get. So I at least hopefully keep them a little more separate. I will do my best to kind of do that for you on the podcast because I know how horrible it is keeping track of all of these names. But Valon and Theodrin. Valon and Theodrin. They're names you should know. Valon and Theodrin. That is my job. Any last thoughts on these two chapters? I think this is exciting. We're getting things going. But as you mentioned a little bit earlier, it's like we're kind of starting the Egwene book, even though we've already done the intro chapters in the Perrin book.
Oh, and I think I would say for those reasons, it was only natural to feel kind of a loss of momentum, but sometimes people confuse a lack of momentum for a lack of progress. Ooh,
right.
That's it. Oh, can you make a t-shirt of that? Which we are making progress even if we have lost the rapidity at which we are making that progress. And so, so were these my favorite two chapters? No, but I really did, as I alluded to, enjoyed the map and seeing a little bit more of Tar Valon. And I am excited to be back with this set of characters. I think what I've learned as I've gone on is whichever character dominates for like 5 or 6 chapters, I get antsy to get to a different one, which I think is the opposite of the Game of Thrones problem. Game of Thrones, I think, always changes every single chapter. And you're like, wait, I really just wanted another Arya. What? It's 60 chapters from now. I can't stay up that late. And so I appreciate that this is not following that model either.
The magic of Robert Jordan is how he somehow makes you want to leave behind characters who you will then immediately want to get back to. And that's partially why I think that this is when this series starts to pick up a little bit compared to the first two books, is because you don't ever get a 30 chapter Rand run in the way that you kind of do in both of the first two books. And that's a win in my book, right? Even a 30 chapter Perrin run or Egwene or anyone is too much. I'm a real big fan of like, okay, give me 2 chapters from this person and then jump to another and jump to another. So even this kind of long stretches, it can wear a little bit. I think you're right. And so new is always better, as Barney Stinson would say. And that's very exciting, in part because next week we don't have 2 new chapters to give you. We have 3 new chapters. We are going to be discussing Chapter 12, The Amerlin Seat, Chapter 13, Punishments, and Chapter 14, The Bite of the Thorns. And just by way of a really quick bit of preview, it's worth noting that Chapter 12, The Amerlin Seat, has a brand new POV character whose head we have never been in before. And with that, Greg, take us out of the episode.
So your homework class is to read those 3 chapters, but also watch 2 episodes of the television show. And you don't have to say goodbye to us for nearly as long as you usually do. We will be back in 2 short days. Those insert episodes will be labeled clearly. So if you don't want to participate in the television show, still download so we get we'll pretend there's revenue involved. We don't get anything.
There's no ad revenue involved.
Go ahead, download them anyway to keep our numbers in a place where our egos are nice and friendly.
Do it for my self-esteem, please.
And then we will catch up. The Wednesday episodes are not pausing, not changing at all. So if you're only interested in that experience, but again, we would say we love our community and we want to keep it growing. So if you know somebody who's watched the show but not tried the books, who might be interested in checking us out, throw those episodes those way, throw it up on your social media, tag us, and we would gladly whatever. I mean, it's not retweeting. Again, I already gave the date for when we're recording that. It's now re-Xing, I think. Ugh, what is happening on that social media platform? Find us on Instagram instead, and we'll catch up on whatever you're up to, and then see you all the time through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.